On behalf of the Board of the Fine Arts Society of Peoria, again, I want to welcome you to the May lecture, The Architecture of Carlo Scarpa, Recomposing Place, Intertwining Time, Transforming Reality. I want to thank Bennett Johnson, immediate past chair of the Programs Committee, for organizing our series of lectures this season. I think those of you who have attended several or all of them will agree with me that Bennett and his committee, that was Tom Romanowski and myself, succeeded at taking us on a wonderful journey. The previous 6 lectures have explored how American artists responded to their environment, starting with original inhabitants and bringing us last month to building and city designers of the future. And I'll ask again that everyone in the audience, please turn your microphones off so we don't have any interruptions. Thank you very much. Today's lecture moves us off of the American continent to look at Carlo Scarpa, one of the most enigmatic and underappreciated architects of the 20th century. I think we might be changing that today. He's going to be very well appreciated. Scarpa is best known for his instinctive approach to materials, using common materials in combination with precious ones, and combining time-honored craft techniques with modern manufacturing processes. Among his best-known commissions were renovations of existing buildings in which he skillfully balanced old and new by keeping certain historical elements as he introduced new ones. The perfect person to introduce us to this amazing man is another talented architect who approaches architecture as it is experienced from within, not just from the external view of a building, and who is particularly interested in methods and materials of construction and their interrelationships. This is someone who has spent considerable time over many, many years experiencing the interior spaces designed by Carlo Scarpa, and therefore he truly understands them. Robert McCarter is a practicing architect, author, and the Ruth and Norman Moore Professor of Architecture at the Sam Fox School of Design and Visual Arts at Washington University in St. Louis. He holds a master's in architecture degree from the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation at Columbia University. He earned a Bachelor of Environmental Design from North Carolina State University. He has taught and held administrative positions at several other schools during his career, including the University of Florida and Columbia University. He has been appointed as a visiting scholar at the American Academy in Rome on 3 occasions. McCarter's architectural practice has constructed 25 works over the past 30 years. Current projects include, in association with Alfonso Architects of Tampa, Florida, the renovation of Le Corbusier's atelier and apartment in Paris, France, and the garage conversion of Alvar Aalto's Maison Louis Carré, also in Paris. McCarter has authored 23 books on general and specific topics such as Marcel Breuer, Frank Lloyd Wright, and to our interest today, Carlo Scarpa. And you can see that both behind me and you can see on the screen his magnificent large tome published by Phaidon on Carlo Scarpa, which was published first in 2013 and was reissued just a few weeks ago at a very reasonable price. So I highly recommend it. McCarter was an international exhibitor at the 2018 Venice Biennale of Architecture and was named one of the 10 best architecture teachers in the United States in 2009. It is with great pleasure and anticipation that now I would like to introduce and turn this over to Professor Robert McCarter.
Well, thank you very much, Kristen. And also, I have to thank Bennett, who contacted me some time ago and started this ball rolling. I'm going to attempt to screen share now and get the slides up and running, because this is, I assume everyone can see the...
Yes, that's excellent.
And I'm going to jump into the lecture because, in fact, this is rather lengthy lecture, which I would argue is necessary when attempting to understand someone as embedded in his context as Scarpa is. So, and I think the logic of the title of my lecture, Recomposing Place, Intertwining Time, and Transforming Reality, will become evident. Carlo Scarpa is a unique figure among second generation modern architects because he's embedded in the archaic and anachronistic culture of Venice while transforming the city by weaving modern spatial concepts into its fabric. I would say to a degree unmatched by any other modern architect, Scarpa stood in these two worlds, ancient and modern, a particular historical place, and the larger contemporary world. But his work also joined these two worlds, redefining preservation and restoration through works that integrate, engage, and transform their place. Time is also extremely important to Scarpa's work, particularly as it's embedded in the rituals of everyday life and how they act to inextricably intertwine the past, present, and future in these works. And then there's the very commonly discussed issue of his use of detail as a kind of condensation of boundless whole into a precise part, what we could call the articulate joint. But overall, the key issue is the fact that his architecture is determined and shaped by the experience of the inhabitant as someone dwelling in a particular place in a particular time. So the first section of the lecture and the large part I would call Venice and Tradition. Carlo Alberto Scarpa was born in 1906 in Venice, and his family moved to Vicenza. These images are above in 1908. And Vicenza, of course, is the city of Palladio. And he lived there until age 13 when his mother dies, and the family moved back to Venice in 1919, where his father is a teacher, a school teacher. Summarizing Scarpa is no less challenging than summarizing Venice for anyone who hasn't been there. But one could begin by talking about the sort of nature of the relationship of the city to the water. And this is on the left, Vittorio Carpaccio's Miracle of the True Cross of 1494, which is a scene that I love because the canal water appears to be the ground because the only ground that people are visibly standing on with any regularity is the water itself. And then there's also a typical canal scene in the upper right. And then, of course, something that at least until this year has been both a plague and an atmospheric element of the city, which is Acqua Alta. And I would just want to take a moment to mention that last October was the first successful test of the Leonardo Dam system, which are 3 dams at the edge of the lagoon. And they succeeded in stopping a high water event. And so presuming they continue to work as they're designed, there is some hope that major Acqua Alta events, such as I have the photograph in the lower right, will no longer plague Venice in the foreseeable future. And there can be some repair work done on the areas where the water has damaged low-lying areas for many years. And that work is actually ongoing. A building that was of particular interest to Scarpa, though I have to say he's interested in all buildings in Venice, is Pietro Lombardo's Santa Maria dei Miracoli of 1489, with its book-matched marble walls inside, but on the exterior also the use of prune stones, the pinkish color stone, and the Istrian stone for the columns. And the glass in the windows, which is a ancient disc-shaped glass that dates from the period where Venice was initiating the use of glass in windows. And as Adrian Stokes says, that the glass shines with the very translucence of water. Stokes also goes on to say, in Venice, light and shade are recorded, abstracted, intensified, solidified. Matter is dramatized in stone. In 1926, Scarpa graduated from the Royal Academy of Fine Arts with a degree in architectural drawing. And he began teaching at what was that same year the newly formed Istituto Universitario di Architettura Venezia, the IUAV. So he was actually one of the initial faculty members of the what's now the architecture school that trains the licensed architects in Venice. But in 26, he also began his career, a kind of parallel career, which was actually his dominant career for the first few years, working in the Murano glass factories as a designer. He first worked with Capelin from 1926 to 31 until that company folded, and then he moved to Venini, a well-established company where he worked from 1932 to 47. And I'm showing some examples of work, and I won't go into the details of how these are made, but they comprise two types of glass. One is glass that involved research by Venini and also Venini and Scarpa into ancient Roman techniques, which had been lost, at least in terms of knowledge of how they were actually could be fabricated. There were examples that Venini and Scarpa used to research the tessera, the use of the tessera, such as the central piece, pieces of glass cut into strips and then cut into small pieces and fused together, tessera, and which is a Roman technique. And then new techniques, including embedding gold and silver into the glass. But I have to say that Scarpa also either completely invented new techniques which had not been used, or at least we don't know that they'd been used before, or somehow I have the, I don't know if you can see it, but it's on my screen. Invented new techniques, which include new uses of the grinding wheels and new ways of applying the color or finishing the product, so-called battuto beaten, which is actually the grinding that you see in the lower left, but also the pennellate in the upper left, which was a technique that he developed where you take thin strands of glass and you drag it across the still hot vessel, and it sort of, he said it was like brushstrokes of color. And I have the picture of Frank Lloyd Wright on the right, because in 1951, when Frank Lloyd Wright came to Venice, he met Scarpa, who he had only first met in Florence a few weeks before, when Scarpa went up to visit Wright, who was installing his exhibition, a big international exhibition that traveled around the world, which was not coming to Venice, but he invited Wright to come to Venice to receive the keys to the city. And so he was met at the airport by, Wright was, by Scarpa and Bruno Zevi. And they walked through the city, and at the end of the day, they went to the at Wright's request, they went to Murano, to the Venini showroom. And there were display cases in there, and the piece in the lower right was in the display case. And he asked to purchase it, Wright asked to purchase it, but was told that it was not for sale because it was a one-of-a-kind piece. And he said, I don't really, price is not the object, I want to have this piece. And they said, well, it belongs to the family, it's one of a kind, it's not for sale. And Wright got quite irate, as he could do. And then he said, well, could you please show me all the pieces that are available? And that led to him being taken to another case. Scarpa was there, apparently in the background, not saying a word. And Wright commenced to choose 8 objects. 1 or 2 of them he bought 12 of, so he could give them as gifts to his clients. And we have the sort of receipt from Venini for these purchases. And every single one of the pieces he chose in quite rapid order as meeting his interest, including this piece that he couldn't buy. They were all designed by Scarpa. So I think Scarpa's engagement of the glass as his first way of entering into the Venetian culture and his dramatic change of that industry, because in fact, many of the techniques he invented are now used widely in contemporary glass making. Is part of his relationship to history, and one of the ideas that will be quite strong, which we'll come back to a little bit later, is Giambattista Vico's statement, verum ipsum factum, which reading Vico, it can be translated, we can only know that which we and our kind have made. And he argued for history as a human construction. And I think Scarpa probably has an even more narrow view, saying we only know what we make, which is his definition of learning by making. And it's this combination of material culture and material imagination, as Gaston Bachelard called it, which makes Scarpa's work unique. And his simultaneous engagement, Scarpa's simultaneous engagement of the Venetian culture and modern international design ideas, which is reflected also in the glass. I think it epitomizes something that Joshua Reynolds said in 1797, quote, "Invention is a new combination of those images that have previously gathered and deposited in the memory. Nothing comes from nothing. The architect who has laid up no materials can produce no new combinations," end quote. So one of the early, not the first, but one of the early architectural commissions of Scarpa was characteristically an interior renovation of Ca' Foscari, which is the economics faculty of the University of Venice, 1935-7. That's in the upper left, that initial intervention, which was quite precedent setting in the sense that he completely detached this new curtain wall from having any direct relationship to the Venetian Gothic tracery that's actually making the opening on the exterior, pulls it back behind and gives it a much more modern and quite functional, in the sense that the larger elements are the operable portions of the window and the narrower elements are the fixed portions. But this notion of a modern layer and an ancient layer together making the pattern that comes in the window would be highly influential. It's also quite functionally intelligent, because obviously the tracery is quite a challenge to glaze. And then in 1955-56, kind of indicating the influence of Wright on early Scarpa, I would say on all Scarpa, but particularly early Scarpa, is his coming back into this same room on the other side of the room, not something that can be seen in this photograph, where there was a set of sort of seats that had been built against the wall. Now he had to provide a walkway, a passageway that could move through the space and allow you to, because this is the ancient palace didn't have corridors, it was all enfilade. So to get from one part of the palace on this floor to the other, you needed to pass through this room, but without disturbing what's going on inside. So it's a kind of passageway that also has these kind of visual panels that you can close if you don't want to be distracted by people passing by. And these are photos. And just some, in addition to the sort of forking structure, which is very Wrightian, if you think about Taliesin West and other works, there's Scarpa's use, or I should say reuse, of woods that were used in the building of gondolas and the other pieces that go on the gondola, these different colors of hardwoods that you can see that are bound together to make these columns. That's something that you'll see again in future works. Other early works which show the influence of Wright is the book pavilion at the Biennale, which along with the entry and the courtyard in the Italian pavilion are all done from 50 to 52. And of course, the sort of tilted A-frame is almost a direct take on the geometry of the section of Taliesin West, and here used to create a freestanding element. And then combined with that is a sort of tubular space that runs lower left, runs sort of along and carves its way along the edge of one side. And then into those are cut the first vesica piscis, which is a shape that's created by two circles overlapping to create this kind of a lip shape. which becomes the two circles overlapping, or the double, as well as the Vesica Piscis itself becomes a kind of theme that it runs again through Scarpa's work, to a degree that he sort of said it was his leitmotif later in life. And then this is the courtyard, which has recently been reopened. It doesn't have the original sculpture. It has the stands, but not the sculpture. But everything else is as it was. It was closed for many years for reasons that I'm not totally clear on, but it's been reopened and allows one to step out of the central pavilion, as it's now called, have a small break, as well as being, as always with Scarpa's work, a kind of play, or a very serious play with the idea of the layers of land and water and their ambiguous relationship in Venice, which also includes very thin pools that are less than 2 inches deep, and then other pools that are right next to it, that you can see in the central right-hand side of the central one. That's the deep pools next to shallow pools, and then different layers of water, and seeming and occasionally indeed sliding up underneath the walkways. So even this little courtyard is you could say, a little bit in motion all the time. I want to mention a couple of things. Elie Villers-le-Duc said in his Entretiens of 1872, "We must endeavor to proceed like the Greeks. They invented nothing, but they transformed everything." And the architects in the audience may recognize a little bit of that, because our colleague, the great Portuguese architect Álvaro Siza, said, "Architects don't invent anything, they transform reality," which of course is his interpretation of that. I want to also show Scarpa's drawings, which you will see a lot of. You will also see some of my own sketches, and I trust you will be able to tell the difference. But Scarpa's drawings are different from almost any other architect's drawings, because the design process is bound up with and literally consumed by the act of making. And decisions regarding materials and craft, discoveries made during the construction, they're all somehow embedded into these drawings. Each drawing is a self-referential archive. It's not a kind of linear record, but it's enfolded and layered. It's a kind of design process embedded and inlaid in the finished construction. And if you look at both these drawings, one for a project that was never built, lower left, and one is for a house in Zurich on the upper right, which was realized, you see a series of small drawings, often axonometrics or perspectives, of details or intersections. And these are made on a stiff cardboard, so they actually are quite stiff, and their drawings are happening on both sides of the paper. And even though these start with the plan, they also involve a series of discussions happening on the site about the ways to accomplish each of the sort of intersections and details that are shown in the plan. So they involve what I would call corporeal imagination. There's often, as you'll see in the sections, the body of the inhabitant. It's very much about the nearness of things, and trying to grasp and record a sense of the sensorial richness of the materials and the space. And it's a fusion in a way that I think is not possible in the typical kind of construction drawing sequence of construction and conception. So the concept and the construction are somehow embedded together. So Scarpa's first major work, again, is a renovation of an interior space. It's the Gallery d'Accademia, arguably the greatest collection in Venice and possibly Italy, which he worked on from 1945, immediately following the war, all the way to 59. It involves 3 different buildings, which have 3 different floor levels. And one is this Santa Maria della Carità, it's a Gothic church, and then the Palladio Convent, and then the so-called Scuola, which is a sort of guild meeting space, which was attached to the church. And this is one of my drawings in the lower left, and this is the entry on the left. And the first room that one comes into involves really sets the table for what Scarpa will do with museums. He wants to bring the visitors to the museum into a direct dialogue with the art. So in this case, a very large room is divided by these freestanding panels, which allow you a view of a certain grouping of paintings normally related to each other, but actually also blocks the view. If you're coming close enough to see them, your view is blocked to the other paintings. So it's not about putting things around the walls of the room that one can survey the whole collection, but in fact, you enter into what he's creating as a kind of smaller rooms, and you have to, as you see also in the horizontal elements, you have to sort of come close and put your body into a certain dialogue with the painting. And this reaches a high point later in the academia. But he does engage in a series of transitions between the spaces because, as I mentioned, there are different floor levels in these buildings or among these buildings, and then they often are very strategically placed either to block your view of an entrance until the very last minute, and also as a place that art can be displayed, but also in the case of the upper right, sort of setting up the view, choreographing the view so that as you go up the steps, you're sort of being given a little bit of a preview of what you might go to first in that room, which is the small masterpiece room. And I just show these two, his drawing. Scarpa would spend hours sitting and looking at the paintings that he was asked to cite in these spaces, because he was not only the architect in the normal sense, the interior designer, or whatever you'd like to call what he's doing here. He's also the exhibition designer, because he's positioning these pieces. And so he entered into a dialogue, not only with the curators, but also with the paintings themselves. And you can see the accuracy of the drawings in the lower left, and how he's creating, in this case, the small masterpiece room holds exactly that. And he thinks the room is actually even still too big. So he divides it into two rooms with this wall panel, which itself becomes a place that small pieces can be given their own position. So they not only have whatever frames they may have or may not have in some cases, but he gives them a new frame or a new sort of position sort of embedded in the wall. And again, it draws you in closer because the paintings are actually pulled back into the surface of the wall. They're not projecting out from the wall in the case of this new central wall. In the upstairs room are the sort of some of the masterpieces. Well, everything's a masterpiece in this collection, but the two rooms, one that has the large Venetian scenes by Bellini and Mansueto and Canaletto and Guardi that show Venetians using the various famous piazzas and bridges and other scenes in ancient times. And then there's the room with the Carpaccio's Legend of Saint Ursula cycle, which we'll touch on again at the very end. But basically you enter the room and you are confronted with her birth. And then as you move around the room, you see her life. And then her actually in coming in the door, you don't realize that you passed her funeral on the, which was behind you as you came in the door. And so this engagement with art is something that Scarpa did not at all think was peripheral to his career, was central to his career. And there were many opportunities, or he made opportunities, I suppose, in some ways by offering to be involved. In this case, there was an offering of a small grouping of 18 pieces by Paul Klee in 1948, which is only 10 years after, or 8 years after Klee had passed, for the Venice Biennale. And he designed the room. He was able to spend a huge amount of time with these 18 pieces, and he decided to actually base the design to some degree on Jaffnet, which is folded, which is in the upper right, and the actual way in which the room is, he's dropped the ceiling with this canvas, sort of translucent canvas above, and because it's in a much bigger room. And then he's folded the back wall around, and then created these panels in which, again, the paintings, in many cases watercolors, are embedded. And you can also see the use of the multicolored wood, in this case, to make these kind of columnar elements that help structure it. And in the end, even though the Biennale had asked him to do this, they said they didn't have the funds for it. So Scarpa ended up paying for this exhibit himself. He felt he learned significant amount. A very early and important museum, which still exists, but is not as well known as it should be, is the Correr Museum, which is actually right on the Piazza San Marco, which he worked on from 1952 to 60. Several important things here. There were 2 floors. The historical floor is an image on the upper left, with these fantastic rifles that look like they're getting ready to sort of rush off into battle. And then there's the floor of the of the art collection, and as you enter, you come in lower right into the so-called Gothic or ancient collection, where you're greeted by the Doge who's coming out from the wall on the right. And then on the other side of the translucent glass that you see there in the lower right image is the room on the left, which has the Renaissance or the later images. But you don't physically arrive to that room in the sequence until the end. And so you actually begin and end in the same room, but because of the way the ceiling is organized and also the size of the space is appropriately scaled to the number and size of the pieces. What's really a breakthrough and is very important in this in the Correr Museum is his first employment of the easels. And he employs these easels, as you see in the left-hand side, particularly for several reasons. One is that the painting can then be put in a position. These are windows that are facing north, and so they don't have direct sunlight, and they can be getting the light, as you see very dramatically when you walk into the room. And the other is that you can really walk up and address the painting in a very individual way, in a way that's really just not possible when it's on the wall. And so the choice of which ones are on the easel. There's also the sort of hint, a little bit of a hint that somehow that maybe the painter is still working on it and they just walked out of the room and you come in. So the sort of easel, which is a fantastic object, which is now very expensive to have made or to find an original, but it still has this sort of informality that comes with the painter studio idea, which he's bringing into this otherwise much more formal than it would appear gallery. There are other special rooms like the Carpaccio sisters in the lower right, where there was originally 2 saints, and one was no longer existing as far as they know. And so Scarpa represents the absent, the absence of this saint by just having a blank panel, as if they sort of temporarily moved to somewhere else. And then a room for the works of Antonella Damascena in the upper right. And Massina will play a big role in the next project, which he received because of Roberto Calandra's visiting the Correr Museum, and then first inviting Scarpa to do an exhibition on Damascena's work, which you see in the upper left is Scarpa's reframing of an existing room with the use of these drapes. And then immediately following that, he was asked to renovate the Palazzo Abitalis in Palermo of 1953 to 54, which had been heavily damaged in the war. And he replaced a number of floors and ceilings, and also the whole courtyard is a new invention. And the walls on the far side of the courtyard, he very clearly reveals that this is new plaster work by having these expansion joints running in a very asymmetrical and sort of dynamic pattern, and yet the windows are in some ways even emphasized by this. And the collection, you begin your tour of the building by confronting this very large fresco on the triumph of death. And in my sketch in the lower left, it's underneath the dome of an existing, or what was a pre-existing church, and which has been refitted to provide the kind of light that's needed, that drops down vertically. But the panel is just a bit too large for the end of and Scarpa somehow perversely enjoys this, so he he carves these notches in the side, and then actually the whole panel is mounted on a pivot hinge, which I show how it can work. It can pivot open in case there's a need to do work on the backside, or otherwise get different access to the panel. So it's as if somehow this panel is not only expressing the specialness of this remarkable fresco, but it's also to some degree sort of making it very clear that it was not painted for this particular space, which again was the altar of a church. And then the other parts of the collection, for which is well known, is the work of Laurana, the sculptor. And you see some of his pieces on the right, particularly this beautiful piece set against the green background. And also in the stands, there's a sequencing through a series of rooms en enfilade, and you can see the kind of expectations and setup in the lower right of seeing into the next room and seeing this figure highlighted by the natural light against the green polished plaster background. And then you see again the use of the multiple, here even in Palermo, the use of the multiple colored gondola woods in the stands. And then going upstairs, the entire floor and ceiling needed to be replaced here, but the walls were kept. And again, the windows were framed with new sort of modern interior glazing. And then the great masterpieces of the collection by Damascena on the left, particularly the Madonna, and then the three saints, which are on pivoting. Madonna has her own sort of stand, which is placed in the center of the room, and at least theoretically can be moved around, but gets the ideal light. And then the saints actually are on the wall and they can pivot, and in fact they do move. And last time I was there, I did move them, and you can adjust them as to the changing light as the day goes, if you wish. But they're in the sort of position of doing respect to the Madonna. And then the last room you visit is actually, again, though now at the upper level, over top of the storage of paintings, which is in the major part of the lower level of the church. You find this great fresco again, but now you see it from above, and you see the light coming down from the cupola. Another important, but I would say maybe certainly more than some, but still less visited than it deserves, is the Gypsoteca Canoviana edition in Posagno, which is the city in which Canova was born and where he had his studio. In fact, this is an addition to an edition, which was the original edition was made to his studio, and it was to, and so Canova had a very unusual working process, at least I think it's very modern in some ways. So he would work in this room that you see in the upper right, which is in the tower at the far eastern end of his studio, and all the way up at the top of his house. And he would make the plasters here, and then he would make drawings first and then make plasters. And then you see the doors on the left. The doors actually open 4 stories above the ground. And so he has a winch, and he could lower these plasters that he had made of the sculptures, and they would be taken off to Rome, which is where the marble workshop was. And his marble craftspeople in Rome would prepare the block of marble down to within something like a 1/16 of an inch of the final shape. And then Canova would sort of sweep into town and apply his world famous technique of finishing the marble so that it looked like human flesh, for which he was highly, highly regarded. But this is not a museum of the marbles. This is a museum of the working process. It's a museum of the plasters. And so you see some of the plasters that have been smaller plasters that have put it here. And then the larger plasters are in the rooms that the previous architect had designed, the so-called basilica, and then the small addition that Scarpa made on it. So I think there's 1 or 2 marbles, but I do believe the vast majority are plasters. And on the upper left, you can look into the old basilica portion, which was originally a dark gray, and Scarpa convinced the curators of this to paint it white. And his new gallery is all in shades of white and off-white. In his opinion, much more subtly flattering to the plasters, which themselves are not works of art, but and in fact are you could say they have defects in the sense that they have small, many of them have small black tacks driven into their surface, which is how the sort of craftsmen in Rome were able to transfer the dimensions from the original plaster to the final marble using calipers. But I think Scarpa's case for the notion that the plasters are more clearly revealed, he felt that a dark background basically was way too much contrast, and the plaster just turned into a white glowing thing, and one doesn't see any of the detail. So he uses Closetta marble, which is a whiter marble on the floor with very, very sort of minimalist joints. Everything is painted white. There's rough plaster on the wall, so as not to be confused with the smooth plaster of the pieces. And then he has a series of I-beams that you can see on the lower left, upper right, that run through the room. And these I-beams are rotated. I just would mention, this is an idea that is that they rotate their orientation sort of 90 degrees, each of them. So this is an idea that comes from the Maison de Verre, whereas if you look closely at the Maison de Verre of Pierre Charot in Paris, you can see that he rotates the I-beams as they move across the room. He uses also in the lower part, what you're seeing on the left in these shots is the wall, actually the exterior wall of the old basilica, which he's now brought part of inside and then keeps part of it outside. And then you choose between this room at the top or going down to the bottom, and most people go down to the bottom first where the three graces are, and you see very clearly the black pins that have been put into the plasters, and then they are seen against a pietra tenera wall, which is a marble that comes from Vicenza, or a stone that comes from Vicenza, which is a sort of off-white, which that wall and the wall on the other side, which is plaster, both run outside, and you can see the sort of effects of interior and exterior. Also point out that the glass at the end, which he was unable to get in a single sheet, it goes below the floor and above the ceiling, and he had to use sections of glass, and he decided rather than minimize the joint, he would actually have it sanded at a 45-degree angle. So again, you get the glass actually also, when seen, is seen as being a white substance. And this is contrasted by the black, in a very subtle way, by the black bases and wooden elements that are part of the cabinetry that holds the very smallest clay pieces. When you come back up, you enter this final room, which is actually the room that in Scarpa's mind is in dialogue with that vertical studio of Canova that you should visit first, but not everyone does. And this room has four windows that two of them are projecting into the room and two of them literally project out of the room, as you can see in the upper right. And they produce a series of lights and effects washing the walls, and also the sculpture that are really quite remarkable. And I think it's important to remember, again, for Scarpa, this was probably a commission that for him was a more important commission than would have been a sort of straight museum for Canova's sculpture, because this is about the process of making, which he's feels is, if anything, the most important aspect of what we do when we make, is the process of conceiving and making and the use of material. So when this was opened, he reported that it was a very fine blue sky, and the sky looked as though it had been sliced into blocks, as he said, as he's recorded as saying, and you can see that on the day this photo is taken is very similar. So one of the things that hasn't been pointed out as much as it should is the proportional relationship between Scarpa's vertical gallery and Canova's original studio. And in fact, I've been many times with architects and others, and everyone goes straight to the Scarpa. I think it's very important to know that Scarpa would have never gone straight to the Scarpa. He would have gone first to Canova's studio and began to understand the process of making. So Canova's studio at the top of the tower, these two spaces are sort of at the diagonal ends. This is in the upper east and the other is in the lower west. These two rooms, and Scarpa, as you can see by my notes on the left, the Canova room is 18 by 24 by 18 tall, by the way, very Palladian dimensions. And then Scarpa's gallery is 18 by 18 by 24 feet tall. So that if you take the Canova gallery and you tilt it up on its end, you have exactly the Scarpa, or the Canova studio becomes the Scarpa gallery. And he also makes a play on the windows. Canova has these three windows, these fantastic windows that go all the way right up to the ceiling in three directions. And they're the primary source of light, and they're in the center of the ceiling. And Scarpa reinterprets this as the corner windows, which also go all the way to the ceiling. In fact, cut holes into the ceiling and cut through the ceiling. The Olivetti showroom, which was Olivetti's calling card on San Marco. So it wasn't really a place that was intended to sell Olivetti products, but really more to give them a presence on the most important address in the city. Super limited context in the sense that he was expected to put 2 layers of space in here, while at the same time raising the floor, because this is the part of the piazza that's flooded the most, and also lowering the ceiling because the structure which was holding up the rest of the building above was needed rebracing, so there had to be new steel put in. So there was really not sufficient space for 2 full floors legally without a little bit of inventiveness on his part. And there were 2 columns existing, which he enlarged by wrapping them with a marble. And then of course he needed to have a stair that went up above. And he said that of course he considered putting the stair along the edge or in the back or somewhere, but that, you know, it was much more interesting when it was actually in the middle of the room. So you can see his plan, a typical plan, so many layers, but you can see quite clearly the original conditions. And he felt quite strongly that limitations such as this were really what gives us freedom, and that there's really no freedom possible without sort of severest kinds of limits. This is on the northern side of the piazza, and these are original photos of the original condition, and shows the main entry directly off the piazza and the arcade of the piazza with these pre-existing windows, the sort of double glazed box windows that project out, which were not Scarpa's design. They exist all the way along the arcade. He put an inner lining on them that we'll see when we get inside. And then at the back, this sort of service entrance, which is the first of Scarpa's stone doors, which is an idea that comes from a church in Torcello that has stone shutters. But this idea of using stone as an entry, or unexpectedly the stone opens and becomes a door. Scarpa's material palette is expanding rapidly at this point, and he's experimenting with many things. And the photos I'm showing, by the way, are coming from different periods. The one on the upper left was towards the end of the time that Olivetti was still in the space in the 90s. So you see some fairly modern machines, and then you'll see older machines, because currently it's now leased by the city, and had donated early Olivetti machines are now being used in the space because Olivetti ceased using it in the 90s. So the floor is made of a in many ways very traditional Italian or particularly Venetian material, which is terrazzo, which is marble chips generally set into a concrete cement paste, and then sanded down, ground down to reveal the sort of matrix of the marble. In this case, he's using leftover glass from the mixing bowls in Murano, which at the end of the day, the color has kind of become quite mixed, and it's not really useful anymore. But he said to keep the pieces and to fire them, harden them, and then cut them into tiles. And so these are hand-laid tiles by the terrazzo So this is terrazzo. It's terrazzo in terms of its technical description, but it's terrazzo in a designed way that's perhaps new, and also using a material as the glass paste tiles, the tessera. And then of course there's this staircase, which in my mind is somehow a sort of a meeting of Michelangelo's great stair in the Laurentian Library with some kind of de style composition. And it does quite a beautiful job of kind of starting very straightforward and then beginning to slip, and then it slips to the degree that it produces small spaces, but also occasionally places where sculpture or even some of the artifacts, the Olivetti artifacts, can be placed. I'm not going to be able to talk about all the details. The stair itself is quite remarkable in that one can't see exactly how it's held up, because you see floating pieces coming towards you. When you're directly walking to it for a moment, you can glimpse these very small brass pieces that you can see in the upper left, just a glimpse, that are actually holding the cantilevered part. And of course it's large enough that it becomes a kind of meeting place of sorts, and it takes you up to the very cleverly designed mezzanine, which has got a very thin floor and is hung from the ceiling and pinned on the wall. So, you know, working in tension, which of course it can make members thinner. And that's where a number of the machines are done. It's also a very lightweight structure, and it doesn't really touch the walls in every case. So it moves a lot, and it creaks and makes noises when you're walking on it. It in many ways reminds you of a boat, which is what it's supposed to. It's also built in some ways out of the same material, the bronze and the wood. And then at the end is the Vesica Piscis window opening, which again is produced by the intertwining of two circles, and with the Brazil wood screens that could be opened and closed, looking through those pre-existing windows back out into the piazza. An interesting project just to contrast or compare with Olivetti is the Gavina showroom, which is a furniture showroom in Bologna, which again is Scarpa working outside of his Venetian context. This is from 61 to 63, so a few years after Olivetti. And here it's a very strange plan, as you can see in the upper left, and there are in fact 4 columns on no particular grid. And he decides to add a 5th column, which is not a structural column, but it's one that he can play with. He makes openings that cut through it. And so it's the black one if you're looking for and the others are the actual pre-existing columns. And then there's of course a stair that's projecting into it on one side. He also brings, as you can see in the lower left, he brings into the little office space above, again, the sort of multicolored woods that originally, of course, coming from the gondolas, probably not in Bologna, and then he also makes a new facade, which you're seeing part of in the lower right, which is, it's an existing building. He's just taking the whole lower floor out and putting a new concrete facade inside. Again, this was for the company Gavina, though it has also gone through many owners since then. In the back of the room is multicolored tile work, which that's Scarpa's drawing that wraps around the corner in the upper right, and then you see the finished tile work, which wraps around a small fountain, which is underneath a skylight, one of the only sort of other sources of light in the space. And that was done by Mario De Luigi, who will be his colleague and cohort in tile work, but also polished plaster work, stucco lucido, for the rest of his career. I think his ability to respond to the sort of completely different character of Bologna, which is a hot city, arcaded, heavy, deep shadows, is really quite remarkable. But you can see a great deal of continuity in terms of material use and other things. Another less well known, but probably for functional reasons, is the Manlio Capitolo courtroom, which is in the main Palace of Justice building in Venice, and which is very much still in use, and one sometimes has to wait quite a while if you're lucky to be able to slip in if it's in between sessions in the courtroom. which was done in Venice in 1955 to 7. So this is about the same time as the Olivetti. And it's one of Scarpa's few uses of this curved plywood, which he puts yellow stain on the edges, as you can see in the upper right. And I recently visited it. It's in remarkable condition. In fact, I have photos, but they look exactly like these photos. So there's a sort of small story that goes along with this. When this courtroom was first finished, or was just being finished, Scarpa was sued by the Venetian Architectural Association for practicing architecture without a license. Given that remember, he'd been teaching at the architecture school since 1926. So this is 30 years later that he's sued by them for this. And the court, in one of those great coincidences of life, the trial was held in this court. And so the Architects Association made the arguments standing in this courtroom that Scarpa was not able to make, not qualified to make architecture. And the judge apparently looked around at the space and said, well, no, I'm going to have to disagree with you on that, and you're going to lose the case. Scarpa actually never again had any association with, he won that case, but he never had any association with the Architects Association after that amazing coincidence of having the trial be in his own courtroom. Conflict of interest, I suppose, but a beautiful one. Perhaps Scarpa's most visited and most famous is the building is the Castelvecchio Museum, which he worked on quite continuously from 1957 to 75, and with one piece that wasn't finished until 83 after his death, which is again a renovation, and it's the renovation of the Scaligeri built castle, which is, you're seeing on the upper left, it's all the sort of more ancient looking stonework. It's not the piece across the back that you can see in the lower photo. So originally the castle was built not to defend against invaders of the city, but to defend the Scaligeri family against the uprisings of the citizens of Verona. So in fact, it turns its walls towards the city. And the bridge that you see was actually built by the Scaligeri so that they could escape across the river to their allies to the north in case the citizens really got completely out of control. So then when the French troops under Napoleon took over the city in 1802, they actually built this building along the back because they had to defend against the Austrians who were across the river now to the north. So they built this, the river edge piece of the castle, which was has this thick defensive wall, and then in front of that was a barracks, which had just a simple set of square windows. And then when it was turned into a museum, under the directorship of Antonio Avena, working with the architect Forlati, they restored both the residence, which is on the left-hand side of this tower in the upper left, and then they restored that to a Renaissance style that it never actually had. And then they turned the barracks, which had a series of square, sort of looked like an Aldo Rossi building, square windows. They turned that into this kind of Venetian palace by reusing a series of windows that were from buildings that had been damaged or destroyed in floods in Verona and had been kept in storage. So they were sort of reconfigured, and you would enter the museum originally through the three arched opening in the center. And then Scarpa's drawing in the upper right shows both the museum actually quite precisely, the lower floor of it, but also the strongest part of the drawing is the landscaping, because he was very interested in how he would choreograph your arrival. So you see very small incidences that are almost, that you really have to look for, like the little bridge that shoots across in the lower left that comes from what's now a pedestrian bridge across the river, which is connected to the city again, and then to this courtyard across the moat. And then the double hedge that sort of gives you a new horizontal line to read the building against, because it's in a slightly sloping situation. And then he placed the entrance not in the center, but in the upper right. And there's a dialogue that goes on between the entry, which is in the upper right, or lower right in these slides, and this opening that he creates between the barracks and the original city wall, he sort of takes out one bay of the what was the barracks, and creates an outdoor room in which he puts the Can Grande statue, which is arguably the sort of most historically important piece in the collection, is sort of positioned at the midpoint of this section of this new outdoor space. And you see both of these as you come into the court. You're not sort of able to approach the Can Grande statue except visually, and then you're invited to come to the entry. And the entry is a very subtle series of layers of water and land that, in fact, the land slopes up ever so slightly, something like a little less than 6 inches. But when you start your walk on this walkway towards the entry, you're a few inches below the water. And then when you get to the top, you realize that you're a few inches above the water, and the water becomes a kind of measuring element. But the water itself has also got fountains sort of sitting in the middle of it, and gardens floating out into it. And it's on both sides at certain points, so one's not sure exactly. Again, we're in Verona, but he's playing with water in a way, in a very serious way, that reminds us that we are in the Veneto. The entry is on the upper right, and the entry and exit are actually sort of modulated by this wall that projects through the opening, the original opening. And again, he plays with these existing openings, well, pre-existing but not original, because he knows that they were sort of a previous reading of history. But rather than return the facade back to its Napoleonic state, he actually celebrates and keeps the sort of, you could say, fake history of these windows that were put into this wall. The windows themselves, of course, have a history, but the position in the wall is not. He's able to play with that in a kind of aggressive way, both at the entry and with the small sacello, the small sort of room that has the special smallest pieces. And the wall of the sacello is made of different colors of prunestone, but either polished or rough, sort of hammered finish. And if you think the pattern is arbitrary, you could say it is, but it's drawn very carefully in the drawing, and that drawing has 11 rows, and we'll talk about the importance of the number 11. But the pattern is something that's Scarpa's kind of invention that he reuses repeatedly after this, which is this notion of a square element. You can see in the upper image, a larger square element out of which a smaller square has been extracted, exactly one quarter. So you get a 3/4 square and a 1/4 square. And then the two squares are made of either the same material treated differently in terms of polish or rough, or slightly different materials, all with the same color range. When you come in, the entry room is, you kind of pivot around at the entry room, and the exit also comes down in that room. And so these are a whole series of details of what happens in that first room on the left. And then you turn and you look down the sort of enfilade of series openings that Scarpa has completely redone this lower floor. There were originally 5 rooms, but he lines up the openings and also redoes the floors, and the ceiling has been dropped. So there's a new roof, a new ceiling overhead. And then these openings have been reconfigured. And you step up onto this floor, which doesn't quite touch the wall as it goes around the room. And the floor is made of concrete with bands of prunestone that are running through. The concrete, though, has been treated. You can see a little bit in the lower right photo. The concrete's been treated by tamping it while it's still wet with a stick, a flat stick, so that basically it makes a series of lines in the surface of the concrete as it's drying. So it's a very, very ambiguous reading of the concrete that feels almost like stone. And then when you go in the first room on the lower right, you see the sacello from the inside, and you go out into that room, which has its own terracotta floor and steel frame and black polished plaster walls. But again, you're getting the opening of the original window above it, and now the new Scarpa window on the inner edge. Again, Scarpa is engaging us in a dialogue with the artworks, and in this case, each one is positioned as he preferred it to be, treated as if it is, which in his mind it was, special and unique. This first sculpture room after the sacello room has these figures, and you see how they look towards the light, look away from the light. They also are, the majority of them are sitting on what I would call water bases. That is, these polished plaster bases, which, as you can see, you cannot see what's holding them up. So they float above the floor, and then the sculptures kind of very ambiguously float above them, or rest anyway, apparently very lightly on them. And the color of the polished plaster of these is almost exactly a match for the Venetian canals in a normal season. They're actually quite clear right now because there's no one there, but or at least last time some friends of mine sent me photographs. But normally it's a kind of deep green-gray color, which is quite beautiful. And there's a sort of porosity to these. On the left is a figure that Scarpa very intentionally positioned with the sculptures back to us, as you can see in the right-hand photo, as they come in the room. And then Scarpa in a film is engaging in a dialogue with the sculptor. He's also explaining why he positioned it that way, because in his mind, the problem with having you face the front of a sculpture is you will look at the face, of course, of a figure, but you will not think to inspect any other parts like the back or the sides. And in fact, in his mind, this incredible braid that's running down the back of this figure was by far the most important part of this sculpture. Of course, it's the most intricately made piece, which is why Scarpa would think that. And so he actually positions it so you have to see this braid first, and then you go around and look at the face, but now looking at the face with the understanding of this braid. Then perhaps you do as my friend in the lower left is doing, and you take a position and make a small sketch that sort of allows you to see both sides of that figure. And again, how the window is reframed, or how the windows are reframed, the large ones with the sort of new, almost Mondrian sort of inspired operable windows and fixed windows that are brought inside. And then you arrive to the middle room, which again was originally the entrance. And you can go, at least ideally, you can go in and out here and see some of the sculpture that you see in the upper left that's positioned outside in this small plaza that is where the original entry was. Or you can proceed on to the final two rooms. This is the largest room. It's interesting that he puts this wall on the right, which is quite beautiful and has a series of fixed pieces that are, again, individually sort of positioned. The way that they're held is always unique, and puts them in a certain position with respect to you, but also with how their weight is being held by the metal bands at the ends of the walls in some cases. But behind that, of course, are the restrooms, which he's cleverly inserted into one of the sort of beveled openings in the thick outer wall. The third room has among other things, this crucifix, which was taken off of a very large wall panel and put on a new panel of Scarpa's design, this kind of T-shape. And I've got sketches in the upper left showing kind of what happens behind that. And then the two saints, who originally had no particular relationship to this, to the crucifix, are put on these two bases. This is a room where, among other things, you might also notice that in the center image, the sort of particularly interesting way in which the new floor was made. It's a concrete floor, and it has four sort of sections that with board form that rotates in a kind of pinwheel. And then there's board form beams, which are run through the middle. They make a cross shape. And then at the center, but only running down one direction, is the steel beam. And that those bear where one would expect to have a column. You get one set of beams bearing onto another beam, which is the concrete bearing onto the steel. And then there's a small pivot, which is a little bit hard to see there, but there's a sort of rocker piece so that you recognize the different movements of the two materials and the sort of openness of the joint. And then into the final room where there's an opening in the floor. One of the things that was discovered by Scarpa was one of the original city gates, which had been completely lost and buried amongst all of the in the work of the Scaligeries on this old castle. And then he found a new moat, which he gives you a view down to that moat, which is dry now, but just a sort of sense that originally the water came and protected the city, that is the castle from the city. which is sort of counterintuitive to how we think that it should be working if the river is the edge of the city. And so continually reminding us of the sort of double-sidedness of this castle. And then you pass out this door at the end, and you get you could say your second look, I guess, at the Can Grande statue, which is actually from this plaza. And we'll see several views of this plaza. This is the view from through the old city gate, looking back at the gallery building. And then I'll describe the reason for this interesting position of the Can Grande. The height also, it is a statue that was designed to be seen from below, so its features are distorted, and so this is the actual correct distance that you should see it from standing down below. Then you go up to the tower and come into what's called a residence, and the residence, as I said, had been sort of redesigned by Forlati into a kind of Renaissance, as if it was a Renaissance palazzo. Scarpa kept most of the sort of beams, both the real beams and the sort of faux beams, so to speak, and then and a good bit of the frescoing and other wallpapering kind of fresco sort of paintings on the wall. Made new openings like this keyhole door at the end in the lower image, and then you see another easel at work. So extensive use of the easels, but you also see in the upper right the idea of the pivoting paintings that are able to be pivoted into different positions to catch light or catch views that we saw at the Palazzo Abatellis. When you exit that, you come back across and you can look down into this plaza and see the sort of double layer of it from the castle walls. And at this point, perhaps it's interesting to look at the two drawings in the center, which are John Ruskin's drawings of the original statue, which is here now in the museum. What you see in Verona now in this position is a copy because of the deterioration of the original, so that had to be put under cover, protected. So these are his drawings, and you see that he's drawing it seen from below, and a close-up view also how the statue is sort of looking down a little bit at you. So again, Scarpa's put it into the correct position, and it also accounts for this slightly strange angle at which this, or could seem to be slightly strange angle at which the sculpture is sitting in this space. It was kind of looking back at the building, but not directly. And this also has to do with orienting the sculpture correctly to its original orientation in the city, in its original position as drawn by Ruskin. And then on the right are the hand-drafted drawings done by Richard Murphy many years ago with his students from the University of Edinburgh. This is still the most important study of this building that exists. So this is the upper gallery. This is on top of the sculpture gallery that you came through before, but now instead of the movement being at the center, the movement is along the edges. And when you first come in the upper right, you can look back and see maybe, well, it's not your last view, I suppose, because you see it also when you're leaving, but your last sort of formal view of the sculpture, and you're looking straight out at it at eye level, seen through the window on the left. And then you move through this series of galleries, which have terracotta floors and gray polished plaster ceilings. And then the very last room, which was actually not quite, it was designed but not finished until after Scarpa died. It was finished by Origo Rudi, that we'll hear from later, has a blue ceiling, and that's on purpose because all the paintings in that last room, which are called the Avena room, are from sort of Baroque period, later period, so that and with a lot of blue backgrounds. And kind of interesting anomaly that happens there is that there's this photo taken by of Scarpa with this painting Quattro Santi Camaldolesi by Gian Domenico Tiepolo, which is from 1760. And I have a photo of the actual painting on the lower right. It's not quite sure when Scarpa took this painting, but it's another example of him somehow entering into, literally in this case, a physical spatial dialogue with the painting, and that he assumes the same posture of heavenly gaze as the people, as the saints, the four saints in the painting. The Fondazione Corini Stampaglia, renovation in Venice of 1961 to 63. So again, still a very early work, you could say. Scarpa designed a new entry. This is Richard Murphy's drawings on the upper right. This is the renovation of a historic palace on the first floor, the Piano Nobile, the first floor European, that would be second American, is the library of the family, which was donated along with the house to the city, and is actually quite a well-used research library. But unfortunately, it entered from the lower floor, which had become flooded. And so Scarpa was hired to make the lower floor passable again. And originally you entered from this super narrow walkway on the right, less than a meter wide, with almost no light. And Scarpa proposed in the very first proposition was in fact a new entry, which would be to make a new bridge and take one of the windows and turn it into a doorway. And this was the first part of his proposal, but it was only approved at the very end. And probably only because the mayor of Venice, who was at that time an architect, overruled the preservation board or the planning board. So there's this new bridge right next to what was the former bridge that you went to the land entry. And this, of course, is also addressing the fact that buildings, all of these buildings in Venice were designed to be entered from the water. The land entry is more for service, you could say, or but not for the sort of procession of entry. And so while we can't use the entry portico, which he's given a new gate, we still enter in some ways right next to it through this new entry. And then gives him a chance to sort of make a dialogue between the original bridge, and you see in the upper right, and the new bridge. New bridge is double steel plates. They're split down the middle, and then on top of that, wood walkway, and then at either end, Istrian stone abutments. The bridge is actually asymmetrical because it starts on the piazza higher, and then it has to come down lower to get into the doorway, to get headroom to come into the doorway. Again, many parts of this bridge recall, particularly the wooden handrail, exactly the way one makes pieces and parts of the gondola. When you entered, originally you came into the room on the right. I'm just showing also the sort of to make the point that this was designed to deal with, but also in some ways to embrace in a way that's not, well, I don't think it's done anywhere else in Venice, to embrace Acqua Alta. So Scarpa had two problems. He couldn't raise the ceiling because there was this severe limit on that, and yet he had been originally hired to raise the floor. If he raised the floor high enough to avoid flooding, there would have been insufficient headroom. So he actually keeps the floor not quite at the original level, but not a little bit raised, and then he makes a trench around all of the lower rooms in the front of the building, and in fact allows the Acqua Alta to come into the room. So these kind of trenches along the edge of the room that you see on a day of Acqua Alta are full of water, and it's a magical experience. And this front room is also designed as this is the sort of, again, this is you would come down and into this room, and this would be your first stop. And for many years, there was a discussion about how this floor had been, the pattern of this floor had been influenced by Albertson. And then, if not too long ago, there was a drawing discovered, and this is not a particularly good. This is a photocopy of it. It's not a good photo of it on the left, but you can see that Scarpa's drawn in the exact pattern of an Albert's piece called Bundled. It's actually a very early piece. It's a flash glass piece from 1925 when he was at the Bauhaus. But then at some point he switches to something that's based on this other pattern that we discussed at the Castelvecchio, which is the 3/4 square with the square 1/4 square removed. And so the pattern is quite complicated. It's made of I think 3 colors, all the same finish in this case, or 4 colors, I think. And if you think it's an arbitrary thing by the mason, again, the drawing on the lower right is Scarpa's drawing to show the position of every single piece. in the floor. I've actually spent many hours trying to see if there's any repeating patterns within any cluster of 4 larger squares. There's no rhythmic repeating pattern in the space. So, and that's not so easy to do. To make a repeating pattern is quite simple. To make a non-repeating pattern is quite difficult. So the primary purpose of this edition was to get people up to this library. And so he also replaced the stair, which was quite decrepit and needed to be also adjusted in terms of its height because of it did no longer relate to the new raised floor that approached it. And so this is Scarpa's stair, and then this is my drawing. And there are many drawings that show this new set of marble pieces that are sort of dropped into the center of the old stair, as if they are just dropped onto it, and that if one decided in the future, you could just remove them and the original stair would still be there. But in fact, that's not true. And for me, this is one of the key insights into Scarpa's understanding of what renovation and preservation really was about. So he's actually taken the new nosing, the new risers are actually cut into the original nosings. He gives you the nosings on either side, as well as the little piece of the nosing in the center. But if you were to take these new pieces of marble off, you would have notches in the majority of the front of the nosing, which would make them really not usable, because the nosing is a very important part of the use of the stair, the ability to get one's toe underneath there. And so in Scarpa's mind, this can never go back to the original stair. This is not about just putting a protective blanket over the original stair that we now use so we don't touch the original stair. This is scarring the original stair. And so it's a much more aggressive, but in my opinion, much more integrated idea that, you know, if someone in the future wants to make a change, they now have to deal with not only the original stair, but they have to deal with his addition, which scars the original stair and is to some degree fused to it. And he would be perfectly happy if someone wanted to come in and do something different, but they need to deal with all the layers of history, which is a key insight that Scarpa brings to his work that I think is not recognized often enough. It's not just very clever preservation at all. It's about the modern layer being just as important as the original layer, and that it's most important that all the layers, including even what you might call fake layers, like we saw at Castelvecchio, fake history, whatever that is, that also is somehow worth keeping and worth remembering and worth engaging. So this is the old gondola entry, which again, the floor has been raised. The floor water, as you saw on that earlier slide, actually comes into this space. He has a new set of stairs that'll take you down to that gondola entry. And then at the end is a room that's originally was proposed to be just used for exhibits. He leaves the floor in that room at the original level. So on the lower image, you can see what happens when it floods. It has a new floor, but the floor is down at the original level. And so it's actually a kind of register of why he was hired to do it. Unfortunately now, you can no longer enter across the new bridge he designed. You have to come in through the very enlarged Curini Stampaglia. I say unfortunately, because you no longer get, you know, the intended experience that Scarpa has. And you actually enter through this room, which is quite, I always tell my students they have to sort of close their eyes until they get into the original entry hall, because it's quite disconcerting to come into what Scarpa thought of as not only the end, but as an end that you wouldn't necessarily even go into. You can see how the bridge that comes into the room, this sort of elevated floor, doesn't really have a proper way of descending. And then you move into the main aula, which is for lectures, but also for exhibitions. And here the water doesn't come into this part of the building, the Aqua Alta, but he sort of references it by pulling the concrete floor up with the Istrian stone strips, and pulls that sort of concrete floor up, and then transitions at that point to the travertine walls, which are Roman stone, and they're cut so that you see the grain is rotated from vertical to horizontal. 11-inch centimeter wide frosted glass lights set into the panels, and of course there's 2 wall panels with separated in the middle by a hanging a brass strip that allows you to hang things here on exhibit. And then at the far end of the room is another stone door, which lets you into a small side gallery, and which is designed so that you can put your hand into this small opening and open and close it without endangering your fingers, as you would if you moved in the other. It's actually not as heavy as the door at Olivetti by a long shot, but still, nevertheless, it is a stone door. And then at the edge, he brings the, again, interior, exterior out. He actually brings the floor level out into the garden. But like all gardens in Venice, in order for larger trees to be existing in the garden, it's necessary to raise the soil of the garden. So he's actually excavating a little part of the garden here. And then you confront, after you've left, you confront this change of elevation. So you sort of come up against this wall, which seems to be filled with water. And then you have the higher, which gets the roots of the trees up out of the salty groundwater. And then he reuses a whole number of pieces, including this lion and other elements in the garden, and the old wellhead, because all these gardens also originally functioned as places to gather the rainwater, because there's no fresh water source in Venice originally. Now it's a kind of relic, but he associates it with his new fountain and water course that runs across. And then he uses pieces of Istrian stone sort of cast into the concrete to elevate sort of just normal concrete up to sort of another level, as my sketches attempt to show. And there's this linear wall of water, this water course that one confronts when you come out of the room, and it has its origin on the upper left part of the left-hand slide, upper left slide, and then it comes from there and goes past the lion and then exits. And the lion, of course, is a representation of Venice. It's important to note that the water source is in the east and the lion is on the west side of this courtyard. So in Scarpa's mind, Venetian culture in many ways originates in the east, in the Orient, and arrives to Venice. And then in this case, passes back into the recycle. And then the main fountain, which is at the far end of the courtyard in that upper left photo, actually uses a piece of copper work that he used in the Italia 61 exhibition in Torino that you see an image of in the upper right, including Mario De Luigi's tile work and other sort of representations of glasswork from Scarpa. And so he brought that here, and that was inserted. So it's an original, it's not original to this courtyard, it's sort of recycled to some degree in this courtyard. And then on the far side of the wall, there's another small garden. The last building, which I'm not showing last, but you'll see for why, the Banco Popolare di Verona, which was again an addition, though in this case an addition where the company purchased the buildings adjacent to its headquarters, which you see in the upper left, and then demolished and asked him to make a new infill building that would then sort of connect together all of their buildings. And the lower right, it's worth mentioning the site because it's quite close to the arena, as you can see, the curved form in the lower left. And then there, it's sort of straddling between two small piazzas. The left hand of the two piazzas is actually the piazza for a small church, and the right hand is more of a business piazza, which is where the bank headquarters were. And when they purchased this site, which as you can see doesn't quite fit into the first piazza, the upper piazza, the bank said they would buy the building in the middle of the piazza, this donut-shaped building, and they would knock it down so that you could get a full view of Scarpa's building. And he absolutely refused, because he said then you would be combining these two piazzas. One is for business, one is for the church, and you can't do that. So he actually said that no, that he actually preferred the kind of diagonal view that you can see in the upper left that you have to take in order to, if you wish to see his whole, if you want to see his whole facade, there's no frontal view of it. And then here are the plans. And then the facade is one of his most remarkable pieces. He lived in Verona for a better part of each week during the time this was in construction. Arrigo Rudi, who's in the photo at the upper left, and he's in the upper left of that photo, is his associate who finished the bank. It was pretty well designed, but Rudi finished it up after Scarpa's death. And the facade is made of a series of layers. It uses a number of interesting materials, including Botticino marble down at the bottom, the sort of white marble, Then the red Veronese stone, which is cut into the ziggurat pattern. And then the plaster that you see in the major part of the upper part is a cocciopesta, which is made of brick dust or terracotta dust. So it has a kind of reddish pinkish color to it, but it's layered as, you know, you could say at a minimum 5 to 6 layers and possibly 11 to 12, depending on if you count each of the ziggurat steps, which, and then windows that are recessed behind the wall, windows that are flush with the wall, and windows that project in front of the wall. And these photos are from after the renovation, which I'm sure Scarpa was rolling over in his grave, because all of the beautiful stain marks that he had so carefully designed of the water running down the facade was all cleaned up and erased in the mid 2000s. And I visited with the bank president. I just said to him, "You're very lucky. You're very lucky Scarpa's not alive anymore, because this would not meet with his approval, even though, you know, there had been deterioration, but for Scarpa, the deterioration of weather and human use is something that should be embraced and should be part of the building's character. It is not something to be erased every so often by a renovation." I don't really have time to go into all of the things that happen in this building, but the upper level is quite interesting, executive office level, where you have this sort of recessed glazing and the double columns and the 2 sets of I-beams that are separated by a small layer of tiles. And the Vesica Piscis now as a 3-dimensional element of 2 spheres that are interlocked, that are cast in Muntz metal. Also, the cornice line that you see at the very top is something that was inspired by buildings in Venice. Because he found that when you're walking through Venice, you're constantly seeing the edges of the building against the sky because of the narrow streets. And he realized that when there was a profile that you could pick up a kind of detail, that was much more interesting than if the profile was below, which is typical to have the dental moldings and other things beneath the edge of the roof. So he flips it up and makes this kind of roof that has a series of things that can be read against the blue sky. And then the building has 2 facades. It has a courtyard facade, which is not public, but it's surrounded by other buildings owned by the bank. And there's a bridge that connects across to the back building that you see on the left. It's also designed by Scarpa. And then you get some details here of the Muntz metal Vesica Piscis, 2 intersecting spheres. The sort of stair that's used to connect the 2 executive floors, which sort of presents itself, this glass stair on the right. And then this is the main floor, the sort of mid-level piano nobile floor, where the public could come and interact with certain members of the staff. Really beautiful way in which the structure is actually shown to you in the ceiling, even though it's also still a kind of a flush, flat ceiling with bronze panels and polished plaster panels. But then you see the board form concrete that indicates where the structural beams are. Pairs of columns that are cast into bronze tubes that are slightly sunken into the floor. And then at the top, a Muntz metal joint that seems to join them, and also gold leaf pressed into the ring around the top of the column. Then there's just the stair, a series of fantastic stairs, each one different. This is the stair that connects that main floor down to the lower floor, which is where the staff services are. So this is really used mostly by the staff. And here the colors of the polished plaster throughout the building, but here maybe first and very evidently the color of polished plaster of the Marmorino was made, according to Scarpa, to match Mark Rothko, and he gave Mario de Luigi a book of Mark Rothko's paintings, late paintings, and asked him to match those colors. And then going up up the sort of public stair that you would enter through the door that we saw, and then arriving to the executive level at the top. And then now you can see the configuration behind the stretched circular windows in the executive offices, which have, again, a kind of Mondrian inner layer. So in this case, it's all new construction, but he's to some degree embracing or engaging that double layer that was necessary in the older buildings in Venice and Palermo and other places. And then this is an elevator in the sort of red container on the left, volume on the left lower left, which is again only connecting the two executive floors, so it is not going all the way up and down the building. And then this is the stair that's at the very end, right next to the original bank building, which is still the public banking hall. And this was actually designed by Scarpa, but not finished until after Scarpa's death by Arrigo Rudi, who I've toured the building with. I toured the building with a number of times before he passed away recently. And again, it's another sort of innovative use of the polished plaster technology, but on a very thin sort of plywood backing. Which brings us to the last building that I'm introducing, though it's not the last building. It was actually finished before he died, so it's not as late as the Banco in Verona, which is the Brion Cemetery from 1969 to 77. For a small cemetery in a small town, a very famous building, this is in San Vito di Altivole, which is in the Veneto. It's the town where Brion grew up. The story of the commission is rather interesting. The upper left drawing is one of the older drawings, and the brown element is the existing cemetery at that time. It's been since expanded to the right. And the family originally bought 3 of these family tombs that, if you look in the drawing on the lower left, you can see just to the right of the entry, you can see some of these traditional family tombs that are like little houses, little chapels. And then as a kind of precaution, they bought the sort of certain amount of the space around the 2 back sides of the cemetery, outside the cemetery wall, which is a cornfield, because they were concerned that at some point in the future, somebody might build something there, because it was just a cornfield, it could be built in, and that would somehow encroach on the sacredness of that edge. So the original idea, at least while Brion was alive, was that this was just to protect the edge of the cemetery. Of course, after he passed, Scarpa began to work on the project more earnestly, and and suffice it to say that suddenly this boundary zone became actually the cemetery, or at least the extension of the cemetery, which includes several things. It includes a meditation pavilion for the family, the actual tomb of the husband and wife, and then at the lower left, a chapel which is connected to that cemetery. It's a funeral chapel, but it also has an entry so that it can be used by everyone from the town. So it can be entered also from the main street that enters into the cemetery. So you enter, you approach, and the first thing you see is the upper right image, this sort of battered corner, which apparently has the Chinese sign for family happiness, or for happiness, intertwining of 2 people, sort of somehow inscribed into the concrete. Then you see the chapel, which is actually the part that's closest to this road, and you're coming along this cypress line road, and then you see there's actually a new set of cypresses, or a different set of cypresses. They're set inside this compound. And then again, Scarpa's drawings of the entry element. So what Scarpa did was to take this entry element, which was originally sort of conceived by the family anyway as a family tomb, and turn it into an entry portico that takes you from the old cemetery, where we're standing in the photograph on the left, upper left, into the new cemetery. And you go up some stairs, because again, Scarpa has lifted up the entire ground level of this new cemetery, and because the original cemetery is at the same level as the cornfields outside. And so he's basically raised it up. Again, in this case, we're not anywhere near Venice. We're not in risk of flooding, but again, an homage to the idea of the elevated ground in Venice as necessary, and the elevated ground, I would argue, as a sign of sacredness, or a special place. And then he welcomes you with the Vesica Piscis, which are 2 steel rings, actually little I-beams, made into steel and then embedded with tiles. And as you can see a little bit in the right photograph, the right-hand circle is blue and the left-hand circle is pinkish red, so male and female respectively. And then you also see how it frames the new horizon line that the walls make, because not only does he lift the ground, he lifts the walls so that they create a new horizon line. And you have, when you come in, you can turn to the right and go down to this family chapel, which requires actually pushing a piece of glass down into the floor and then stepping over it, and then the counterweights pull it back up again, and then you realize that it's covered with water, so that you've been actually walking on the return sump of the whole water system of this place. The photo in the upper left is a fairly recent one. It's been recently renovated. The lower right was what it looked like last time I was there. And then again, Scarpa's drawings, in this case, including drawings very specifically of his client, the wife, who was the only one alive during most of the design because the husband had passed. And there's this Vesica Piscis eye opening that's cut into the bottom of this chapel, this meditation chapel. This kind of hood that he puts down over your head, you could say. And this photo is actually taken a little bit below that. But if you were to stand at her eye level, your eyes would be exactly in that opening, and you would see the same thing, maybe not quite such an expansive view, but you see the church of the town in the distance, which is where you started your walk to get to the cemetery. And you see in the near distance, the actual tomb of the husband and wife, and then the sort of grass plaza. And then you see the counterweights also on the left that are, which are currently in the up position, which means someone has jammed the door open, but would normally return to the bottom and lift the glass up out of the water. And then if you look carefully on the outer wall, you'll notice that the Vesica Piscis that we saw when we entered, it still has the blue on the right and the pink red on the left, which means that both rings each have both colors. So it's an extremely sort of loaded symbol, because no matter how you look at it, you see these two colors in the same relation. And yet you also three-dimensionally understand that the blue that we're looking at in this photo has red on the inside. And so then you pass back by this Vesica Piscis window, or opening or viewing space, and arrive to the corner, which is anchored by the main burial place of the husband and wife. And what he's done is to lower this space. Again, you feel you're going down, but then remember that the bottom of this is actually only arriving back to the same level as the surrounding cornfields and the original cemetery. So he's creating this special carved, sunken, almost amphitheater-like space with the arcing overhead, much larger than just what's needed to hold the two sarcophagi. And as a result, turning what would have been a very mundane thing, the sort of level of the cornfields around, into a kind of even more sacred space. And then there are the two tombs themselves, which not only are trapezoidal in the sense that they lean to each other, but as you can see, the bottom, the marble at the bottom has been configured in such a way that they almost feel like they could rock, but could tilt even more towards each other. And he talked about this special relationship of these two underneath this this arcing roof with its onyx sort of spine running down the middle, as the notion of the two people who were together in life to be able to greet one another again after death. It's really one of the most beautiful expressions of celebrating death in a certain sense that I know of. There's also as you see, in a kind of relationship to that, is a second building, which is for the children and others. And we're now into the third generation, so there's now a question of where to put the next generation. As you can see, there's a number of tombs underneath this sort of hovering piece, which connects to the new wall. And then sort of dial back a little bit, going back out and coming into the chapel from the way it could be used for a funeral. So on the lower right, you see a very large door that can be rolled back, made of concrete on rollers. And then you can bring the casket up this slow incline on the left, you see, and then turning and going through this T-shaped opening. You get the view back to the husband and wife there, and then you enter into the chapel itself. Through a kind of vestibule, which is then separated from the chapel proper by this omega shape moon gate, I guess you could also call it, but it's not touching the floor at the beginning, so it's clearly a quite literal omega shape. as the alpha and the omega. You saw the alpha when you entered, if you look carefully at the entrance to the cemetery. And on your left is a font, and then you actually enter this space by either opening the people door that you can see in the center lower, or you can swing the entire door, as you see is happening or has happened on the left image, which is a huge concrete door. He called it the Mondrian style door, which is several tons concrete door with white plaster and steel frame, but it pivots quite easily, a gentle push to open, to allow a casket to come in if one is having a service. And then Vesica Pisces in the water font, holy water font as you enter, and then through the omega, and then the chapel is square, but it's rotated 45 degrees with respect to the rest of the cemetery. And then inside you get rotated sort of back again, so to speak, on the diagonal by the position of the little altar and pulpit. And then these candlesticks and other things that Scarpa designed specifically for the space. You can see some of the images have them in their proper position. Small onyx windows opening to the outside. Behind the altar, we'll look at in a second, the windows that can open let water bounce light back up into the chapel, and then a kind of wooden cupola and oculus. And then in the center of the floor, which is otherwise made with stones that are sort of similar, smaller scale, but similar to sort of typical stone pavers on streets, you have this marble inset, black and white marble, which is actually exactly the size of the casket that you would place there. And then the outside, again, lower left, you can see these windows that open. And you go out through the door in the upper right if you want to exit from the back, and then you walk across this and you see this, that in the pool that is surrounding this, so this rotated chapel is also set within a water pool on all sides. And within the water pool are the same sort of stepping ziggurats that are on the land and on the building, but now sort of submerged permanently below the water. And so one's reminded of this notion of the roots of Venice, as Adrian Stokes said, sort of somehow that Venice growing as a sort of vibrant thing, growing from the water, and the water as a rejuvenating thing. So it could be both ruins, but it's also potentially roots or new growth, which of course is both of which would be appropriate for the cemetery. And then on the right is the small cypress garden, which has space for around 25 cypress, but only has 11. So it feels as if it either is very old and many of the trees have died, or that it was never finished. But of course, the number 11 trees that do exist is not happenstance. Scarpa did live for 1 year after this was finished, and he enjoyed it quite immensely. And he talks about the fact that it was his favorite project to visit. And that unlike a typical cemetery, the dogs could run and bark, the kids could play and laugh, and that is what a cemetery should be like. It's about the living. And it's about life. So to finish up his life, I would just have a photograph of Scarpa in Sendai, or in Japan. We're not sure this is in Sendai, but he was in Sendai when he passed away, Sendai. And when Scarpa was in Japan, he liked to assume the culture of the country. And so you see him dressed in a kimono and seated on the floor and working on the low table. He was in Sendai in November 1978, and the story has it that he was on the rooftop, apparently trying to get a better view of a building, and he fell down some roof stairs and hit his head and was in a coma, or at least he was not able to speak. And he lived in the hospital there for a certain brief time and then passed away. But he was able to make small drawings, and he could write backwards. So there are these small booklets he made for some of his friends, which I've seen, which have these inscriptions in reverse, a little bit like Leonardo. but he was unable to speak apparently. I just want to point out that he died in November, the 11th month, 1978, and he lived for 11 days exactly after he fell down those stairs. So he died 11 days after he fell in the 11th month. And he's buried standing up like a medieval knight underneath the small flower piece in the back on the right. And this is a tombstone that was made by his son, Tobia. But for whatever reason, Tobia didn't know, or didn't, for whatever reason, did not follow what Scarpa had said to his friend Aldo Busanaro some time ago, his client also, Busanaro. He had said that he read a poem to Busanaro by Eugenio Montale, and the poem is called "We Never Know How We Will Turn Out." And the lines that Scarpa read were, "And then one day, these words with no sound that we derived from you, fed on weariness and silence, will come to a brotherly heart, well seasoned with the salt of Greece." In Montale quote. And then Scarpa said, "When my time comes, cover me with these words, because I am a man of Byzantium who came to Venice by way of Greece." And so this is where Scarpa is buried. It's actually in the old cemetery, but in the corner that's made around the edge of the old cemetery by the new cemetery. And you enter through the small gate in the lower left and arrive to this back corner behind the family tombs in the old cemetery. So I'd like to just finish with some thoughts, one of which is about the thoughts being about the relationship of Venice and modernity, at least in Scarpa's mind. So despite the ever-increasing difficulties with Venetian preservation authorities who wanted historicist forms to be built new, Scarpa believed that Venice, as he said, Venice, more than any other Italian city, can accept modern architectural designs because of its characteristics of asymmetry, varying heights, buildings tall and short, streets narrow and wide, with beautiful internal spaces. Something he said in 1971. So what I'm showing here are, I'm going to give you a sort of a little redo of a project of a Biennale exhibition that Scarpa put on in 1972, called Quattro Progetti per Venezia, 4 projects for Venice. And it included Frank Lloyd Wright's Mazzieri house, and then later a foundation proposal, which is just off the Grand Canal, for Angelo Mangiarotti, who was a Scarpa pupil and associate, who was tragically killed in the early 50s when he was driving in America, which is a dangerous thing, and trying to visit Wright in Arizona as part of this project. And this is Wright in the center at the opening of the exhibition that I mentioned earlier in Florence. And his drawing of the Mazzieri Foundation, which was the follow-up project that Mazzieri's widow commissioned. Another project in that exhibition was the Le Corbusier's Venice Hospital, which in many ways is the great tragedy that it was not built. It was, and the model is the Corbusier model in the lower left, and then his drawing of the position of the body. But the connection to, and in this case, all of the patient rooms were put at the top, and then the bottom was largely evacuated so that it would be floating above the city and even above the lagoon. A remarkable project. But I just want to mention 2 contacts with Scarpa, you could say, though not direct, which is that during his tour, originally in 1964, he went to visit the Cornice d'Ampaglia, and when he was standing in the garden, he apparently said, "Qui est ce beau artisan?" Wanting to know who was this great artisan or artist. And I think the term artisan would have been very pleasing to Scarpa, somehow standing in both worlds. He also visited, Corbusier that is, also visited the Academia Museum, and he stopped in front of the painting of St. Ursula's funeral that you see a detail of in the lower right. And he made a sketch, which was also made by his associate, Julien de la Fuente, of the way in which she is, as she's being taken into the church, she's being lifted up very high above everyone's head, really, as she moves towards the church. And he took this as a kind of inspiration for these somewhat strangely elevated beds where you can only see the light from heaven that you see in the center section, which was his idea of the upper floor of the hospital, as not having views out at all, but views of the light bouncing off of water, by the way, onto these roofs, or at least captured rainwater. And the three of the four projects, the third one was by Louis Kahn, which was the Palazzo dei Congressi of 1968-74, which was actually a project along with the hospital that was potentially still to be built, which is part of the reason for Scarpa's making the exhibition, was to argue for these. The Wright building was pretty well finished, or not to be built. And it was first done in the Biennale Gardens in the middle right, and then the Arsenale site in the upper right was the final. There's Kahn with Scarpa at his Oslo house with Carlos Vollenrad, who just passed away, I think last year or the year before, who was the associate in Kahn's office. And the book they're looking at actually is the Frank Lloyd Wright vintage edition of 1925, which Frank Lloyd Wright had given Scarpa a copy of, a signed copy, in 1952. And the page, if it's of interest to you, the page that's open that they're looking at is the interior murals of Midway Garden of Frank Lloyd Wright. And in the lower left, of course, like everybody that goes to Venice, Kahn was invited to give a lecture on the roof of the Doge's palace, but that was actually quite a remarkable thing for him, because he insisted on being able to go measure the domes and the way that the lead cladding of the domes was working, because he said if it could last 1,000 years on the domes, he'd use it on Kimball Museum. So to some degree, that answered a technical question in his mind of how to solve his Kimball Museum roof, which is also a curve, not a double curve, I might add. And then as a sort of sad caveat in some ways, certainly as sad for Scarpa, was that instead of Wright's design, he was commissioned eventually to design the Fondazione Masieri. But he was required to keep the facade of the existing building, which the Masieri family had never thought important enough to keep. You can see it's the difference in its grandeur, so to speak, related to its immediate neighbors, which are very important buildings. But what Scarpa did was to basically remove all the interior floors and put an entire new structure inside behind there. So there are now 4 floors behind those 3 layers of windows. You can see in the center lower photograph that the facade is actually literally sort of to some degree pinned away from the new structure, which is self-supporting and just sort of braces the roof. And the only thing you can see that's new on the outside is again the gate, which was replaced by Scarpa, the gondola gate. Those of you that are interested in Venice will know that when he took the project, there was only 1 chimney on this facade. And he said, of course, there originally were 2, so I'm going to put the second one back. And they said, no, you're not. You have to leave it exactly the way it is. This is the kind of thing that irritated the hell out of Scarpa. So he actually went and found a Canaletto painting, which has a view of this facade and shows that it has 2 pots, 2 of these sort of chimney pots, and he was allowed to put the second one on. And of course, it's another double, it's another pair. And these are other views of his interior renovation. And I'm going to go quickly through the idea that you've seen many, many doubles, the doubles often relating to the idea of the 2 intertwining circles, but they're also relating to the idea of linked interior corners. The sort of easiest way to make an interior corner is to cut a hole and let the two saws come together there, so you don't get the crossing happening. And so there's also this notion that 11 was for him, a pair was a physical thing, and he has many pairs, as you can see, of doubles, I guess. But that the number 11 was also important to him. He based almost all his designs on 11 centimeters, and the drawing on the right is for a building in Brescia, or a small monument in Brescia. And you can just see 55, 33, 44, 55. So in addition to 11, it's multiples of 11. He also used 56 and 65, which of course are not quite as clean a relationship to 11, but the 2 add up to 11. And he used subdivisions, including 5.5, which is millimeters, which is half of 11, but it's also another double because it's 5.5. But I think maybe one of the most important aspects of his career is this, going back again to this notion of vicos, of verum ipsum factum, because the gate and the diplomas of the IUAV were remade when he was dean, when he was made dean in 1972. And they both had this verum ipsum factum carved into them and embossed into them, which could be translated as truth is in the made, but Scarpa preferred to translate as we only know what we make. And I think Scarpa's work, which revived a whole series of ancient Venetian ways of making, starting with glass, obviously, but also in architecture. And arguably he single-handedly, or very close to single-handedly, brought polished plaster, stucco lucido, marmorino back into contemporary use, because it's now used all over the world. And he had great respect for craft and craftsmen. And you see him here working with one of the wood craftsmen who was alive until very recently in DNA. And they're actually making drawings on very much the way he does on his paper drawing, so to speak, on the site, but in this case on pieces of plywood. They're actually drawing the details for a table that will be made in this shop. And one of his great followers, Giuseppe Zambonini, said, Scarpa's work is first concerned with the embodiment of an idea through a unique materiality, which deals simultaneously with preservation and innovation. Scarpa has shown that invention is tied to a process where one must interpret and extrapolate from the established tradition. And that brings us to a comment by Scarpa here, seen in his Villa Valmarana and studio in the Villa stables outside Vicenza, or just at the edge of Vicenza. Scarpa said, by restoration is not meant only repair work on old buildings. Our duty is rather to give them a new lease on life so they may be able to live today and tomorrow. In my architecture, all the existing buildings form a part of the métier. That's an extraordinary statement, if I may say. And for Scarpa, architecture is a kind of layering, integration, inscribing, embedding, inlaying of the new into the old. And I think I'll just finish with a statement, or well, I'll let Scarpa speak last, but my friend Kenneth Frampton has said in a very perceptive comment, it is difficult to write about Scarpa's work in a systematic manner, for in the last analysis, his achievement can only be comprehended as a continuum. In his case, there is never the intention of an ideal whole in either a humanist or an organic sense. There's only the nearness of things and their unfolding progression from part to part and joint to joint. Spatial interpenetration, such as in Wright, is largely absent in his work. Place is there, but only as a momentary location that is constantly modified by movement and the fluctuation of light. It is above all a disquisition on time and the paradoxical durability and fragility of things. So the last thing that Louis Kahn wrote before his death, was for publication anyway, was a small piece for the forward of the book, Carlo Scarpa, Architecto Poeta, excuse me. And this is this piece. In the work of Carlo Scarpa, beauty, the first sense, art, the first word, then wonder, then the inner realization of form, the sense of the wholeness of inseparable elements. A work of art makes manifest the wholeness of the form, a symphony of the selected shapes of the elements. In the elements, the joint inspires ornament, its celebration. The detail is the adoration of nature. And then to finish, to let Scarpa finish, a rather astonishing quote. I want to see things. I don't trust anything else. I place things in front of me on the paper so I can see them. I want to see, therefore I draw. I can see an image only if I draw it. Thank you. Stop.
Robert, thank you so much. You have certainly opened our eyes to looking in new ways, and I'm trying to, oops, spotlight myself again, but it's not working. I think I know why, and I won't be able to fix it. But anyway, here we go. Thank you. Well, you took us on an incredible journey, showed us so many layers of information and design. It was just stunning. We do have a few questions. I hope that you can stick around and
I'm up for them,
answer.
but it's been a long lecture, so.
It has, very long, but just a few. One was confirmation. Did Carlos, going back to the Olivetti showroom in Piazza San Marco, did he design the tables, the pedestals that the typewriters were displayed on?
Yes. They're ones that hang in the front windows. They're very strange. They sort of hang and they don't hang. Anyway, and then there's upstairs there, cantilevering off the wall, but they have a small leg underneath them. Yes, everything in there, as you see it now, because I have to say, there was a period it was being used for other things. It was a kind of a tourist shop, and there were things all over the walls, and it was a bit disconcerting. But now they've actually renovated quite carefully back to its condition, which was true all the way up through the 90s when I used to visit, when Olivetti was still in charge. Even to the selection of the Mies Barcelona chairs, which are upstairs. I think that was also his choice, obviously not his design, but yes.
Which work, or it wouldn't have to be a work of architecture, but which element of his work would you most like to explore further?
Well, that's difficult. I would like to spend more time in his private houses. Those are not, I'm one of those architects who thinks very carefully before I disturb people in their private abodes. And some of them become available because, in fact, sadly, the original owners pass. And I've been involved with several sales at Christie's where some of the families have also allowed visits to the house, because the house and the collection often are quite intimately designed. But I would have to say that for an American architect, because of my time, many years, 16 years of teaching at the University of Florida, where we had a program in Vicenza, and then since that time at Washington University, where I visited Venice repeatedly and was involved in the 2018 Biennale. I'm a little embarrassed to say that, with the exception of possibly Unity Temple, which is nearby me in Chicago, I have visited Scarpa's main buildings more often than any project by an American architect. So I cannot claim that I need a lot more exposure. I have to say, though, that every visit to a Scarpa building is new, and I make sketches every time I go, because I see things that I suppose I've seen them. I had an argument with Kenneth Frampton once. We were standing in the Corini Stampaglia courtyard, and he pointed to these small discs that were just under the water level in the fountain at the end, the square copper fountain. And he said, those were not here last time and he visited with me, actually. The last time he visited with me. And I said, well, Kenneth,
They were.
And he said, no, I swear it, they weren't there. And I said, no, Kenneth, they're quite original. They were there. And he said, but I don't remember them. I said,
right.
That is a distinct possibility, because in fact, Scarpa's works are like the city that they're embedded in. It's not meant to be sort of taken in, and then you go back and you saw everything that you could see. There's no such thing happening in a building that's a real building that people live and use every day.
Right.
And so, but for someone as observant as Kenneth Frampton to sort of, he was quite adamant that he hadn't seen those before, and we did agree that he didn't remember seeing them, and because in fact one can only sort of take in so much, and that's the envy you have of someone who gets to live in a Scarpa project or a Frank Lloyd Wright project or any great project, is the sort of angle of the sunlight on certain mornings and things like that you just have to be there to capture. So I always caution in my books that I'm giving you my best understanding, as well as enlightened by having been to these places with many friends and students and others who also give me their observations. But this is just the tip of the iceberg, and that each person finds their own experience in visiting these places.
There are so many layers and so much to see, and so intelligently worked out. His designs, his use of materials, all those little details are so intelligent. I wonder too, though, Do you have a sense of his sense of humor? Because it seems to me that somebody who could work the way he did and have all those little surprises and things might have wanted us to laugh as well.
Oh yeah. Well, he made that point specifically about the Brion Cemetery, is that the fact that the kids were laughing and the dogs were barking, and that he just thought that was just splendid. Well, I did not know Scarpa, as I have not known most of the deceased architects that I've written on. In fact, I'm quite, that's to some degree part of my point of view. I guess I wouldn't call it a strength, but it's my point of view. I'm not in any way overwhelmed by their personalities, except as I can feel them in listening to their recordings or reading their readings. But Scarpa had a wicked sense of humor. And I gave this lecture last year here at the university, and my friend José Burri, who was Le Corbusier's last partner, but who was also teaching in Venice when Scarpa was there, and met Scarpa, and he told a couple of Scarpa stories from his meetings, which I can't tell again because they're quite sacrilegious actually, but they're quite humorous. So wicked sense of humor, but he was quite his anger would go towards those who thought that the way to preserve Venice was to make it look the same as it did look before. As if there are no modern people in the world, as if there's no modern architecture, as if there's no modern life. He really, really thought that that was the most grave error that had not been made by previous generations. And of course, sadly, he's lost that battle because the sort of American interpretation of interpreting back to a certain period has become the norm all over the world. But he made an argument for the fact that each generation adds their own reading, and that includes even what you might call misreadings, like what happened at Castelvecchio, how it's misread. It's a misreading of history to take those windows from houses and stick them on the wall and try to compose something there at the museum. But he loved that. He thought that was fantastic, probably much more interesting to work with than the original barracks, which, because of its function, was not a very interesting building. Where when you compose those windows in that way, they are kind of interesting. But it gives them a freedom to deal with those windows in a way that lets you know that they're not so special, they're not so sacred. There's nothing historically important about it. So the modern element can be woven in quite a strong way.
Two more questions, a quick one. Did he continue designing glass throughout his lifetime?
No, he quit in 47. I would say, though, that many of his glass patterns are still in production by Venini. And in fact, they will bring one of his old patterns back every so often. So there's usually a small group that's always in production, but there's also some they brought in for special production off and on. Many of them are technically really difficult to produce. And so a lot of the stuff that I showed, most of it is in production or was in production. But much of it ended up being, a very limited run, just because it took a huge amount of skill, and not every craftsperson today has that skill. But he stopped in 47, mostly at the insistence of his wife. The problem was in the war, the Venini factory was taken over by the government, and they were making light bulbs. So at a certain point in 47, apparently his wife said to him, "Listen, Carlo, this glass stuff, you're an architect." And he was really, but again, in 47, it was before he received a lot. He was working on the academia, but very, very early in the process. So we have her to thank, because he switched over. He did use Murano products, and he designed chandeliers and other things for them later on. No more of the vases and other kinds of things. But again, you can find many of the originals and also many later reproductions by Venini, which is done in their showroom.
And
but again,
beautifully done.
Every glass piece is different. So in a certain sense, they're all handmade. So there's never a perfect match for what he might have overseen, because he did not make the glass himself. He designed it, worked with the blowers, and he knew exactly what was happening, but he didn't himself do the blowing. So he was always very much, and the same way in his architecture, frankly, he didn't build the buildings. He was very indebted to the craftspeople.
One final question. His architecture seems in some ways very much of its time, but also has a timeless quality. And I'm wondering, have any of his buildings been torn down or significantly remodeled.
Sadly, yes. And the reason is that in not torn down that I know of, though somebody could correct me, or not, well, he didn't do that many freestanding buildings to tear down to start with. Almost everything is either an addition or even somehow inside. But the city of Venice is becoming very American in the sense that even though the city is completely inaccessible by ADA standards, you would say, they have decided that the interiors of buildings should be totally accessible, even though you can't physically get to the damn building. But once you're in the building, however miraculously you get there, because it's not possible to go up and down a single one of the bridges. I've carried quadriplegic students through Venice for months while I was in Venice with the University of Florida group. And I know that you have to go up and down every single bridge by picking up their wheelchair and taking them across. So, unfortunately, the academia, the small masterpiece room I showed is gone. The stairs are no longer used. There's a lift where all the stairs are. And slowly but surely, all the walls are being packed out. They're excusing this for accessibility, but also for putting in a modern air conditioning system, which means that there's no space in the walls. So they have to basically destroy the walls and pack them out with new walls. And it's a very touchy subject. In Italy, it's a real source of discussion and argument, but the plain fact is that the small masterpieces room is gone, and many other parts of the academia are not even superficially like his, and significant portions of the historic portion of the Carrera Museum have also been changed. I will say that I was in Palermo 2 years ago, and I spent a week in the Avatellis, and it's astonishing. And I told them, it's exactly the way he originally designed it, and the way I first visited it in 1980, I don't remember, 1980, 81. And they said, that's because we have no money in Palermo. I said, well, in that case, it's a good thing. I don't believe that, but I think it's because of good curation. But it's a really, if you want the real experience, that's one of the few places that you can get it. I don't think Scarpa would have objected to changes that have to do with a new intelligent designer coming in and saying, we have to do a change. The things I'm referring to are just they're the sort of dumbest kind of renovations that are done, without thinking of any kind of clever way that one can introduce air conditioning or other kinds. We have lots of technology now, but we don't have to pack out every wall. We don't have to destroy every relationship. And it's quite aggravating, because I think if someone with a sensibility that's closer to Scarpa's, that his is yet now another historical layer that we need to engage. Mm-hmm. Then you would have something that he might appreciate, because I don't think he ever presumed that his buildings would stay the same. I do know he would be very angry at what the bank did by sort of literally cleaning all of his beautiful drips and stains and chips off the marble and whatnot, of just, and the sort of dirty places where people put their hands, all that stuff that he loves, all got taken away. Now it's coming back again, but it'll take another, 40 years before it can get back to what it looked like or 30 years anyway, what it looked like in the early 2000s when they cleaned it.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. We should let you go. I do want to make sure everyone remembers that the lecture has been recorded, and the link will be available on the Fine Arts Society website and on our Facebook page, or contact me directly and I can send it to you. Thank you again for just this amazing trip back for some of us to Venice and to Tomba Brion, and seeing so many new things. Such a great appreciation for a remarkable man. Thank you for helping us end our season on a bang. We didn't quite get all 1,300 people, but we had well over 600 people joining us today. And we thank you to all of you who joined, both locally and from around the world. Thank you very much, Robert.
All right. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
We appreciate it.